Rob, how are you today, man?
Hey man, dude, I'm pretty well, dude. It's my day off, so Wednesday's like my sabbatical. That's my Saturday. I try to make sure that I just, plug in and get fed personally, hang out with the kids, so on and so forth. So it's been a good day so far. It's sunny out here in good old San Diego, man. How about you?
Nice, man. It's rainy in Virginia. It's actually a blessing. We haven't had any rain, haven't had much rain at
Mm,
all. So my gardens are loving it. I've been watering
right.
my grass. I'm the only idiot in the neighborhood watering my grass. But not
Yeah,
today, but like I need it green.
right, right.
Yeah. So I don't
We
know.
don't get rain here, dude. It sucks.
No, but
No,
it's
not
always
at all,
sunny
dude.
and 60 degrees.
Yeah, but you need rain. I mean,
Yeah,
everybody needs rain.
for
That's how
sure.
the harvest grows, dude.
Yeah, I need a little bit of rain. So we're trying to figure out what we were going to chat about today, and I think we decided that we were going to dive into the topic of addiction and maybe share a little bit on, some of the struggles of people when they're in active addiction, how they make the decision to ultimately quit, right, and acknowledge that they have a problem and some of the struggles with that. And I figured, man, we just jump in and just see where the conversation goes in
Right.
regards to, we both have the experience, we have the lived experience, we've worked with people in that struggle before. And so let's just talk about that from the beginning, like acknowledging that you have an issue when you're dealing with active addiction. What do you think the catalyst is for most people and being able to get to that point where they move from denial to actually acknowledging, hey, this is a problem that I need to resolve in my life?
Yeah, dude, that's a weighted question in so many different ways because for me, what I had to come to the realization of is I just kept on messing up. And everything that I put my hand to, it would just crumble and fall apart. And so I remember getting out of jail and almost being served a 5-year sentence because of what I did at my previous job and working at a convenience store. And I just took all the money out of the safe and just left this gas station unattended at 12 o'clock at night so I can go get high.
Mm,
And eventually got caught. And so the judge, you know, pardoned me and allowed me to like just have another opportunity. And I tried to go back to this girl that I was with at this time, and she was still in her mess. And I said to myself, I try to like believe a lie that I can go get a job and build myself back up to living a normal life again. But the truth of the matter was, is I was going to go back and do the same thing I was doing before. Find myself stability, have drugs, have money, and then go right back into my addiction. And so for me, man, it took me really crying out to my mother and my stepfather, and I'm grateful for them today because they were the ones that kind of gave me the hard truth. They
mm,
said, hey, look, we love you, but we're not going to tolerate the decisions and choices that you've made. And so, in order for you to be back with us in right relation, you must first make the decision and choice to get help. And we have a vehicle to get you there, which is Teen Challenge. And it was really just that moment where I said, you know what? I'm not really all in with this decision and getting change, but I'm open with the idea of what this vehicle or where this vehicle could take me.
mm.
And so it really just took me humbling myself and letting go of the reality that I, I don't have it under control. And
Yeah.
so I think that was the hard transition for me, is because being on my own for so many years of my life and doing everything, provide provision, so on and so forth, it took me a while to really kind of like grasp the idea that, hey, look, you were never meant to do this on your own. And I think a lot of addicts think that they need to do this life or suffer in their addiction or whatever that they're troubled with on their own. And the
Yeah.
reality is that you're not alone, right? Like there are other people that are going through the same thing, but you need to put yourself in positions that is going to align you with people or put people rather in your circle that are going to give you those hard truths that you might not necessarily want to receive at first, but it's necessary for that transition.
Yeah, and it takes, man. I think there's a lot of conversation, a lot in the addiction circles around rock bottom and having that rock bottom experience, and I don't know. I kind of live in the middle on how I feel about the rock bottoms. Like I understand coming to the end of the road. Rock bottom in 2023, though, ultimately with fentanyl being out there, ends up at death, right, from a lot of
Right.
people, and that's a sad reality. Like it's terrifying to say, well, I'm just going to let somebody go to rock bottom. I think about my journey on that. Like I remember I overdosed on meth one time, was in the hospital, and like, man, I was so outside of my mind with what I was dealing with. Like I had used too much, and I like the nurses were dealing with me, and I'm like mad at them because they wouldn't let me go outside and have a cigarette.
Right.
And even that experience wasn't what did it for me. What my parents did, and we didn't understand what it was at the time, but they did that intervention, and then through the intervention it brought the bottom up. It created a
Right.
crisis in my life to make me realize that something was off. Something was not working, and it had to be pretty significant because as a meth user, there are no emotions, there's no feeling, everything's numb, and I just it wasn't normal conversation, it wasn't getting through to me.
Mm,
Honestly, man, the thing that hit me harder than anything else, there were two things: grandma throwing me out, right? Because grandma was always the safe place. And like, man, I knew I'd really screwed up if grandma wouldn't let me come home.
right. Right. Right.
But then the second thing was when they threw me out, none of my friends picked up the phone.
Mm,
Nobody wanted the homeless Justin. Right? Even though I had drugs in my pocket at the time, nobody wanted the homeless Justin or was willing to give me a place to stay. I eventually
right.
found somewhere, but that first experience of opening their refrigerator and the dude looking at me sideways, like, "What are you doing eating my food?" I never experienced homelessness and hunger, like obviously you can tell, like,
Right.
but like that was like an eye-opening experience for me. And so, yeah, I think that there needs to be some sort of shaking, but you're right, man. Sometimes that shame of,
Mm.
like I'm dealing with all this all alone. Nobody's going to know what I'm dealing with. Nobody's going to understand what I'm struggling with. And I am alone in this battle. It keeps us bound and keeps us from acknowledging our issues.
Well, the reason why I say this is I was just reading an article, and I'm not going to mention anybody's name, but for just, I mean, it's public information, but still, for the simple fact of not, going off on a tangent. But it was a story about someone that received abuse, right? Child molestation and so on and so forth. And reading the article, this had been going on since this kid was 14. Now, this guy is now in his 20s, 21 years old.
Mm,
But the fear of releasing truth, he allowed the lie to keep him paralyzed for so long, even though he had the answer to be released or the solution to his problem, just to share what was been going on in his life to somebody else. Him being threatened by somebody saying, if you say something, I will kill you,
yeah.
caused him to hide behind the solution to his problem. Now, mind you, 14 years old, I probably would have done the exact same thing. But many of us go through addiction with the lie and the shame and the guilt of not being able to articulate or even communicate what it is that we're internalizing. And
Mm,
so rather than us sharing where we're hurt and where the pain is truly stemming from, the rooted cause, because I have a firm belief, Justin, and some people may disagree with me on this, but I don't think people are really addicted to drugs. I
mm-mm.
think what happens is that people have a rooted issue that they've never been able to address, and
Mm.
therefore they hide behind the drugs and allow that thing that they've unwilling to address be suppressed and be pushed down so far that by the time they go to dig it up, all that weight, that pain that they have to relive through causes more harm than actually going through the process of getting the healing that you need.
Yeah.
And so for me,
If
I
I
had to
stop using, I
learn,
have to face it,
right,
you know?
right.
Yeah.
And so, like, I mean, I'm 10 years going on 11 years sober next year, and I'm just now realizing that there's still stuff that I'm having to uh, address in my personal life.
Yeah.
And I might not necessarily be addicted to drugs anymore, but I've pivoted and I found another source of addiction.
Yeah. What was it?
And
NF in one of his songs, he says, I don't do drugs. I'm addicted to the pain though, you know?
mm,
And I think that speaks to the reality of it. It's like, man, a lot of times we're like, well, why don't you just stop using? And it's like, that's the wrong question to ask somebody. Like, it's like, what are you hiding from? What are you afraid to face that you're going to have to
right,
deal with if you do stop using? And I
right,
think sometimes a lot of times we're like, man, just quit. Why don't you just quit? It's that easy. Just stop, get a little
right,
willpower. And it's
right,
like, man, trauma informs a lot of addiction, and understanding that if an individual does stop using, they've got to face some of that trauma head on. And I think that was one of the things, after finally quitting and trying to reprogram my brain and figure out who I was apart from that lifestyle, that was painful work. It was hard work,
right,
to
right.
really uncover and address the reason that I ever started using in the first place. And,
Mm,
Jesus does set us free and make us a new creation. But that process that, when you put the pot on the potter's wheel and they're pounding the clay and they're working it into shape, like that's what it felt like becoming the new creation in Christ. My heart was transformed, but this person had to become new. And a lot of times I think more people are addicts know they need to quit, but they're more afraid of facing the work that it's going to take to become
you,
reshaped into the new person.
the scripture that comes to my mind as we're even speaking was, a brother offended is harder to win than a strong city.
Mhm.
And so I think about how the person that becomes offended, how they have to build this wall, they have to build this city, if you will, and the time and the labor spent on laying brick by brick by brick has caused them to say, you know what, I'm unwilling to remove these bricks now because of the fear of unknown, whether or not I'll be offended again. So
Mhm.
therefore, I might as well stay behind the walls that I built and remove myself from society and become isolated in my depression, my anxiety, my fear, my addiction, whatever it may be. When the reality is, it's like, hey, look, that which you took offense to is understandable, but allow somebody to walk you through that process to begin to remove these bricks so that you can be established and firm in your identity, because I think that's where it stems from. It's all about our identity,
Yeah.
right? I took offense to my mother and my father not being there. Now, I don't even know what they were going through presently at that time in their lives.
Yeah.
And so I made it about me when the reality is it was all used for God's greater purpose and will, and, for my life.
Yeah.
But I couldn't see that in hindsight. All I saw was me. And so sometimes, man, it takes you removing yourself from the center of attention, if you will, and kind of having a bird's eye view, right, an eagle view of the circumstance and situation that's at play. But at the same time, man, it requires you having people in your life. So if I'm an addict now, and if there's an addict that's listening, if you don't want people in your life to kind of speak this truth, and you're not hearing it from your parents or your brothers, siblings, friends, whoever it may be, then how do you come to this realization moment? How
Yeah.
do you? How do you? You know, when did, for some people it might not be like us. So then, for the people that are listening, if they want a solution to their problem, like how would we navigate them through that? Like, you know what I mean? Like, because not everybody has the coming to Jesus moment.
Yeah. For sure.
Not people might not have the functioning homes, or people might not have the family and the resources in their vicinity. So what do they do?
Yeah. Yeah. Who do they reach out to? I mean, it's a good question. I think the challenging part of that is like, does the individual really want help? I mean, even if they know they don't feel like they can get help or they can make a change, and realizing that despite the resources, like that acknowledgement that there is an issue there. I mean, I know 12 steppers talk about that all the time. And, we didn't going through a Christian recovery program, we didn't do a lot of focus from the 12 steps, but they got some things right, like those steps
Yeah.
talking about denial and acknowledgement and, a personal inventory and all that stuff that's in those steps. I mean, there's some powerful principles in there. And
Right.
even though we didn't come up in that type of program, I think that acknowledgement, but I think more uncovering why don't you want to change, right? What
Mm,
is the reason you're afraid of change or you don't feel like you need to change? Is it just being terrified of the change? Is it a fear of the physical detox? You know what I'm saying? Is it a fear of being vulnerable? I mean, you can go through the list, and once we figure out the why do I feel like it's okay to stay here? Then that's where the conversation can maybe go a little further, if that makes any sense.
no, yeah, man, that's actually really good. I remember there was a guy by the name of Steven when we were in Teen Challenge, and something that rang true for me was he's like, people don't have a fear of failure, but they have a fear of success.
Mm. Yeah.
And so I know this is not for everybody because some people might have been in their addiction and had great success and then fell rock bottom. You know,
Yeah.
I had the taste of both worlds. I had money in my pocket when I was in my addiction. I lost everything when I was in my addiction. So
Right.
like I kind of had best of both worlds, but still at the same time, I
Split it up.
think pivoting out of my addiction, it was hard for me to really even see a normal lifestyle.
Yeah.
I didn't know what that looked like. You know,
Yeah, for sure.
because I came out of my addiction. I got married immediately. The first year of my marriage was nothing but fighting with my wife and myself. Then I had my firstborn. So I went through a year-long program still with undealt issues,
Mm.
right? So reality was I only had 8 months of real surrender.
Yeah.
But even in that 8 months of surrender, I was working and doing all these different activities that kept my mind off of the rooted issue that brought me there in the first place.
Yeah.
And so then I stepped back into the busyness of life, never really being able to identify what it was that kept me bound
Mm.
from living free,
Yeah.
even though I was. And so often at times people can say, you know what, I'm no longer addicted to drugs, but still be bound and no longer living in freedom.
Mm.
And so it's not so much about cleaning up the outside, but it's like what is happening on the inside that you're ignoring that the naked eye cannot see.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do we get to the heart of man? And I think the only way, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there,
No,
but I
you're
think the
good.
only way to get to the heart of man when it comes to addiction is to get to the heart of God.
Yeah.
Because compassion is what moves people. When Jesus saw the people that had no sheep or no shepherd, he said, I look at them as sheep without a shepherd. The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. And so we walk by broken people each and every single day. You probably walked by a homeless person this week. You probably saw somebody in need this week, but you identify them as this psychopath, homeless individual, crazy out of their mind. I'm not giving them money, but didn't move with compassion to bring about a transformation in their life.
Yeah.
Because I can recall the moments in my life when I was broken and in despair, and someone reached out to me out of the kindness of their heart. And I felt their heart for me. And it caused me to pivot and make temporary change,
Right.
right? But I needed more of that in my life.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. When we get more offended about the person's lifestyle and when our offense about how that person is living their life outweighs our compassion, then we
Right.
lose our ability to minister to them authentically. Right. Am I
Right.
more bothered by the behavior or am I more bothered by the condition of the heart? And
Mm,
the behavior will trip us up every time, especially if we're not focused on the Lord and knowing that it's not us that can change a person, it's the Lord that can change a person. And so they may be messy, they may be doing things or making lifestyle choices that I disagree with. But I heard this, I think I said this last week on our show, but I listened to a podcast where a guy said, I don't have to sacrifice my conviction to close somebody in compassion. And I
mm,
think that rings true when it comes to ministering to people in our lives or trying to love on people in our lives that are bound up in addiction. I lived it and I don't understand it all the way. Like I
right.
still don't get it all the way. And when we're trying to help family members or friends that are battling with that, there is a fine line between compassion and enabling, like I get that. And that's a whole nother discussion. But just showing people love and showing them compassion in and of itself can open up the door for us to ultimately win that heart,
Yeah,
and that's a
absolutely.
it's a huge thing, man. Yeah. I
Yep.
actually Googled while we were talking on 7 reasons. I found a website and it says top 7 reasons that addicts refuse treatment. And I thought this was interesting. Now, there's tons of information on the internet, but it said they're in denial. They're scared of detox. They don't want to change. They fear they will fail. They don't want to be vulnerable. That's a good one. They want to keep using, or they're embarrassed. I thought that was pretty interesting. Interesting.
Embarrassed. Yeah. Right.
the,
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
yeah,
I mean, shoot. Let's be honest. Everybody wants to keep using.
right.
It felt good. It felt good to be numb.
Yeah.
Like, but I get that though, man. It's you, you know, at the end of the day, everybody's designed differently when it comes to how they receive their breakthrough. The problem is when we begin to try to replicate somebody else's breakthrough to an individual that's not going to work with,
Yeah.
as if that's the way. You
Mm,
understand what I'm saying?
yeah, for
And
sure.
so I parent each one of my kids differently.
Yeah.
They're all mine. They're seed of my seed and my wife, right? So but I can't address my oldest the way I address my middle child,
Mm,
vice versa. And so the way that you look at people is understanding where they're at, right? Like you said, man, I think it gets to knowing the person, right? Because I think half the time, man, we just we have this preconceived notion of who the addict is, right? And so you have the person that maybe never done drugs and said, "Hey, look, like you said earlier, why don't you just stop? Why don't you just quit?" When I can do the exact same thing to that person and say, "Well, why are you always on social media? Why don't you just stop doing it? Why don't you just stop doing this, or why don't you?" And so, but then they
And
look in
and I
shock. They're
need you
like,
to
"Well,"
stop saying that.
but then they begin to justify their actions because they're offended. But the way that you deliver something to bring forth change in an individual's life is through a relationship that's established.
Hey, Kenzie, how are you? And Lisa chimed in too. I was saying hi to the folks in the comments. I'm trying to get better at
Word,
that,
word.
y'all. I'm not ignoring
What's
y'all.
up?
We're learning. We're learning the whole live thing. No, no, you're spot on, man. I think people react to change differently, and it messed with me early on at TC, where I had a guy come in the program. He on he was there for like 3 days, had a great experience with the Lord at the chapel service, and he ended up leaving saying he got what he needed. Now, I'd heard that a bunch of times before, and most of the time that's just, okay, I'm ready to go now. I want to go back out and do my thing.
Yeah,
And homeboy ended up leaving. And I was like, man, what happened? He had this incredible experience with the Lord at this chapel service, and now he's gone already. Like I don't
right.
get it. Until 7 months later, he called me, and through a series of events, he ended up at a train station where he met a missionary who ended up like taking him in and discipling him. And he was on his
Wow,
way to serve on the mission field in a different country. And it was just like the set of circumstances that God put
wow.
together to get this guy discipled and gets him to the place where he was free were something that I would have never planned. And nobody would write a program structure that way, right? I mean, you've got to have boundaries and you've got to have a program. But for me, it was like God had a way that he wanted to get to that individual. And it really wrecked me afterwards, hearing that story, because it's like we got to, what is it, one plants, one waters, but God gives the
Gives
increase.
the increase, right?
We got to water a little bit of a seed that had been planted in him, and then the missionary got to do a little bit more. And now, as far as I know, he's still on the mission field doing that work, but we were a small part of that journey. And so it's a
But
it's
that's what
a,
I'm. But
go
that's what
ahead.
I'm saying though. What if we were so in tuned, right? And obviously this is pertaining to believers, right? So unbelievers probably wouldn't really understand this, but what if we were so in tune with our relationship with the Father and listening to the Holy Spirit that we knew that that was what needed to be happening? Like I think that's the thing, is like we want our hands in the mix of everything, and we want things to be done a certain way. And it's like, man, like taking a step back and realizing how God moves. He doesn't move in an ordinary way. Like it's absurd, actually, because the thing is that if people saw Jesus spit in the mud today and then wipe mud on somebody's face, right? Like we would be like, that's heretical. Like that's heresy. Like what is this person doing? But he did it in the scripture. So then when you hear people do crazy stuff nowadays, it's like, don't get me wrong, test all the spirits, but like, why are we alarmed at what people are doing if
Yeah.
it's resulting in someone having a connection with the Lord?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Because we have this, like, we just have our mind set because of the way that we've been influenced by the world. We have our mind set on a way that things should be done. But
Yeah.
I don't see my situation nor your circumstance or even anybody listening right now that might be struggling with addiction. I don't see any mistake as to where you are currently in your life. It all has a purpose,
Yeah.
but you have to remove yourself from the equation and feel God in that place and allow Him to work out your story, because it's a testimony of the glory of God and His goodness upon your life. And it's His goodness that leads those into repentance. And
Yeah.
so as we usher in God's goodness into everyone's life that we come in contact with, that is what's going to cause someone to change.
Yeah, for
That's
sure.
where transformation takes place, right? And so
Yeah.
for me, when Paul mentioned that in the book of Romans, I'm like, wow. How does somebody change? Oh, it's the goodness of God.
Yeah.
Well, how does somebody know the goodness of God if it's not being, like, it's like, bro, testify, man, share. This is why we're doing this channel, is because we want people to know that we were once there. We're still going through the process, and we're on this journey together. And collectively, if we come together, we can bring about a change in our culture, and God's kingdom can come here on earth as it is in heaven.
Yeah. Yeah, even the people with the most polished stories, the reality of the gospel is that the Lord uses broken vessels.
Right,
Like, no matter how difficult
right.
your past is, how spotless your past is, or spotless, quote unquote, the Lord uses broken vessels. We all have
Mm,
sin. It just happens to be labeled differently for each of us.
right.
And I think that's the encouragement for the person that may find themselves bound and feel like they're embarrassed or afraid to ask for help because they've blown it too bad. It's like, man, God has taken just a lump of clay, a broken vessel, if you will, and put his light in it.
Yeah.
And that's what makes the difference, is the light of Jesus inside of us, not anything we've done. And so, and I know it's easy to say that on a podcast. I've experienced it. It's hard to get to that realization, but it's a lot easier when you have, when you're willing to let people be compassionate. And that would be the challenge, I think, for those that are struggling, is like, man, you got to stop pushing people away, like,
Mm,
and I know it's easy to get on the other side, people on the other side of it, and say, well, stop judging them. But really, for the addict, having lived that, it's like, stop pushing people away that just want to love you. They're trying to figure out how to love you. They don't know how to love you through all of this mess and all of this pain. And sometimes I think we make it harder on them, because they're having to tiptoe around all of our stuff rather than just letting people just love us in the middle of our mess,
so that's a really good point that you brought up, man, and it's kind of like pivot a little bit, but like, what was that for you when you saw that? Like, how were you receptive to the person that like began to pour into you? Like, what allowed you to open that door?
Yeah. Well, I posted my testimony video, one of my testimony videos a few days ago, and it was the day I showed up at Team Challenge. The staff member there, I had been in my grandma's yard after that intervention, and nobody would pick up the phone. And I had contemplated ending my life. Like, I had a
Mm,
I had a bunch of meth in my pocket, and I was going to put it all in the needle. And I had an encounter with the Lord in the yard that night. And people get uncomfortable even when you say that, but I called out to the Lord, and I felt his presence, and I wept. And after being on meth for 5 years, I'd never wept before. There was an encounter with Jesus that took place. Now, that didn't fix it all for me. I still ended up going to TC, but I am 105 pounds. I've got track marks on my arm. I show up at the Teen Challenge Center and talk about being clothed with compassion. The staff member there, he looked at me and I share this. This is one of the consistents in my story. He looked at me and he said, God has a plan for your life. And in a moment, his properly timed words of encouragement cut through all the failure, cut through all the garbage, and I believed it. It was just the timing of it all. And that's what broke through for me. It was somebody just not seeing who I was, but seeing the potential of the Lord inside of me.
Wow,
And
dude.
that
That's
that
so good.
that blew my mind, man. That's, and I it's funny, even today, I remember those words. And every time I start a new effort or I try to pursue something new, even though it was just God has a plan for you, 7 words, right? It was just 7 words. But those 7 words have literally
Yeah,
shifted the trajectory of my entire life.
that's
And
good, man.
that goes back to speak to, regardless of addiction or not, never discount the impact of a word in due season for a friend. Period. A friend, a
Mm,
non-friend, anybody. Simple encouragement and what it can do to transform the destiny and the future of somebody's life is mind blowing. So
wow, that's so good, man. That's really, really good.
yeah,
Yeah, it's because, I think to myself, you know, there's probably people that are listening that might have never struggled with addiction, but may have lost a loved one that never really got to make that or take the opportunity to transform, and didn't receive, and so like my heart goes out for them because it's like, man, how are they processing hearing all this great testimony? And like, if I'm in their shoes, I'm like, well, that's good for you. Like, I'm glad that you came out on the other side of fine. But I didn't. I lost
yeah,
my son. I lost my nephew, my niece, or whatever it may be. And so, like,
yeah, it's painful, man.
how how can God use something like that still, even though there was death that was involved?
Yeah,
You know, and so like that for me, like I've witnessed that too many times in Teen Challenge, and I still get reached out to this day of families and friends where it's like, hey, Rob, I hate to share this with you, but this person passed away or that person relapsed, and I'm just like, man, dude, like, what happened? You know,
yeah,
like, and why did it have to happen this way? But I'm reassured in knowing that there still can be a great impact from that, but it's not easy to overcome, and
yeah,
so that's where I think that's where like communities, man, and just really being receptive to even other people's words, because then what happens is that the person that might never have done drugs becomes depressed or anxiety filled or whatever it may be and isolate themselves just like the addict did, and now they're in the same position that the addict was, where they're not willing to receive any help,
yeah,
you know
yeah, for
and so
sure.
it's like now the tables have turned, and so it's like we have to be very mindful and careful. As people, we're fragile, we're
Yeah,
all going through something, but we must be aware of who God has placed in our lives to help deliver us from that pit. It's
yeah,
like Ecclesiastes, right? Ecclesiastes says, I forgot the scripture off the top of my head, but better two is better than one, right? Because if one falls in the pit, there's one to pull him out.
three
A
strand cord.
threefold cord is not easily broken, and so like we need people in our circle, in our lives, that will help us in the time of need.
Yeah, yeah. There aren't a whole lot of words to say to a grieving parent, you know, and especially one that has done all the things that we talk about they should do to try to get their
Right.
loved one help. And I think that's those moments where like empathy has to take a place in our hearts where we're not trying to fix it because there's no fixing it. It's just we're comfortable sitting with people in their grief because there are no
Mm,
words that I can spit out, especially when they've tried all the programs, they've tried the different counseling techniques, or they've tried the different, strategies that we may spit out, and yet none of it works.
right.
And there's not a lot of words for that, and I think I've seen some moms or dads that have ended up taking that grief and turning it into something, and becoming advocates for parents that are caught in addiction. But I realize that that's not an easy journey to get there, because every time they talk about it, they relive it. you know every time they
Right.
try to encourage another parent, they relive it, they relive their own experience and their own trauma. And it really takes a work of the Holy Spirit to do a healing in them, to be able to get to the point where they can use that pain to minister to other people. And so
Yeah.
you know, I wish I had all the right words for those type of statements, but man, I think as I get older, when I was younger in ministry, I used to give all the answers. Well, just do this, just do that. Well, that'll make you, and as I'm getting older, I'm learning the power of I don't know. Let's go to God together.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know how to help you resolve this grief. We lost a good friend a few years ago, and I, still go through moments of grief, and I can't explain it when it hits. You know what I'm saying? And I can't imagine what that must feel like for somebody that's lost a child, especially to
Yeah.
something as terrible as addiction, and seeing the person change and all of that stuff, man. And so I know one thing that I've learned as I've gotten older is I still preach the power of the cross and the power of Jesus as a solution, but I'm a little I'm a little more on quick to listen and sit and hear
Mm.
people's pain before I just try to preach to them.
No, man. I was just gonna say it's in the quiet, dude. I think that's the biggest thing too. Is when you think about people that are in addiction or even in grief, man, it's like just a simple hug. You know,
Yeah,
it's not. It's just being present, being available. I think is the better word to use. Is are we available for others as others have been available to us?
yeah, yeah, absolutely, man. It's good stuff. Hey, for those who may, I don't think anybody's on right now, but for those who may come along this stream or watch this or catch up with this later, I think Rob and I had decided that we're going to go down this path of addiction and talk about this for the next several weeks. And so if you happen to be coming along and you have questions, you have any specific topics surrounding addiction, please don't hesitate to drop those in the comments. And so we can kind of address some of those things. I'd like to be able to do one of these shows, man, where we can just do some Q&A with people, because sometimes the conversations, you and I are both very all over the place at times. And so
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
just try to follow the Holy Spirit and also my squirrel brain. So I think it would be good to do some Q&A. And I think
Yeah.
we're
Let's do
also
it.
looking at getting some TC grads or folks that have been through this on here over the next couple of weeks too, and helping interviewing them, having them share a little bit more of their story. So I'm stoked about that, dude.
Yeah. That's good. Awesome, man.
Yeah, sweet. Well, I think we'll wrap up there, man. Yeah, so thank you guys for joining and watching. I appreciate it. If you're just jumping on, I saw the number one. We're finishing this podcast up now, but we will be back next week to dive a little bit more. We're going to focus on addiction for the next several weeks. So if you have any pressing or burning questions, please drop those in the comments and let us
Yeah.
know, and we will address those in the following shows. God bless you
Awesome. Love
guys.
you guys.
Have
God
a great
bless.
week.